guys. Tonight, I want you to picture yourself in a world where death waits at every corner, where a single cough could end your family, where a failed harvest meant weeks of hunger, and where the Lord who ruled you could take everything you owned. But before we dive in, let me ask you this. How's your day going so far? And we'd also love to know, where are you listening from tonight? It means a lot to us to feel connected with you, no matter where in the world you are. And if you've had a long or stressful day, here's what I want you to do. Put on your headphones, lie back on your bed, close your eyes, and just let yourself sink into our story. Let it carry the weight of the day away, so you can feel a little lighter, a little calmer, and a lot more free. This was the life of medieval peasants, trapped between plagues, famine, and the crushing weight of power. History remembers kings and queens because their lives glittered with crowns and thrones. But the story of survival, the story of the millions who never held power, who never wore silk or armor, is buried in silence, and that silence is the greatest mystery of the Middle Ages. How did peasants, the most vulnerable, endure centuries where death was not a visitor, but a neighbor? We know the images painted for us. Castles in the distance, knights marching proudly, nobles feasting in candlelit halls. But what those images hide is the reality of the village. The hut, with walls of mud and straw. The smoky air that chokes children at dawn. The mother whose hands are red and raw before the rooster even crows. It is in these places that the true mystery of survival lies, because survival was not guaranteed. Not when plague swept across fields, stealing whole families before the week was out. Not when famine hollowed bellies and left villages silent. Not when lords demanded rent in grain and labor even in years, when the land gave almost nothing back. And yet, the peasants lived. They endured. They carried the world on their bent shoulders, and without them, kingdoms would have crumbled into dust. But how? How did a woman with nothing but calloused hands and whispered prayers keep her children alive in winters of hunger? How did a man without rights face a lord's demands and still find the will to return to his fields the next day? How did families who buried half their children still rise each morning and work for the chance of another harvest? The answer is not simple, and it is not glorious. It is not the story of triumph written in bold letters. It is the story of endurance written in silence. Step into their world for a moment. Close your eyes and imagine walking into a medieval village. At dawn, the fog is thick, the ground muddy beneath your feet. Smoke curls from crooked chimneys, carrying the bitter smell of damp wood. A woman steps outside her hut, a baby strapped to her chest, another child tugging at her skirt. She walks barefoot toward the well, her shoulders already heavy, though the sun has not yet risen. She is not a queen, not a noblewoman. No one will remember her name. And yet, it is she who keeps this village alive. She who draws water, bakes bread, tends goats, gathers herbs. When her child burns with fever, if she falters, her family will starve. If she survives, the story of this village continues. This is the invisible weight of her life, the weight history never cared to write down. And so the mystery deepens. If the world was so merciless, what gave them the strength to continue? Was it faith, whispered through cracked lips in the village church? Was it hope, fragile and fleeting, that tomorrow's harvest might be better? Was it love, the small, quiet kind, that makes a mother rise even when her body screams for rest? Perhaps it was all of these, woven together into a resilience so ordinary that historians overlooked it. What we do know is this: their survival was not luck. It was not chance. It was deliberate, hard, painful endurance. Day after day, season after season, year after year. And that endurance is the greatest untold story of the Middle Ages. The silence of history is not an accident. Kings wanted songs about their victories, lords wanted records of their wealth, and priests wanted sermons written about obedience. But who would write about the woman at the well, whose hands bled from the rope she pulled? Or the boy whose ribs showed through his skin each winter? Their lives were too ordinary, too common, too painful to honor, and yet their survival was the very foundation of everything above them. Think of plague, the Black Death, entire villages wiped out, the smell of death in every street, the bell tolling endlessly for neighbors and kin. The chronicles describe nobles fleeing cities, priests holding mass burials. But the peasants had no escape. They stayed because they had no choice. Their survival meant digging graves for their own families, caring for the sick with hands that trembled, and still rising the next morning to tend fields no one was left to harvest. Survival during plague was not just avoiding death, it was facing death every hour and refusing to give in to despair. And then, famine. Picture a year when the sky refused to give rain, when crops withered into brittle stalks. Bread shrinks smaller each day, until the slices are as thin as a whisper. Mothers chew weeds and roots to keep hunger at bay, so their children can eat the last scraps of grain. Fathers cut bark from trees, grind it into powder, and mix it with flour to stretch one loaf into two. Villages hollow out, laughter disappears, and silence hangs like a curse. Yet some survived, not because they conquered famine, but because they endured it, clung to life through gnawing hunger until the earth softened again. And always, there were the lords, the ones who demanded rent, who claimed the harvest, who punished disobedience without mercy. A peasant might lose half his grain to taxes and still face the choice: starve or anger the Lord and risk everything. Survival meant swallowing pride, bending the knee, handing over the best of what little you had, and learning to stretch what remained. Survival meant silence when injustice burned your throat, because speaking out could cost you more than hunger ever would. This is the mystery history leaves us. How did they do it? How did people with nothing, no wealth, no power, no voice, outlast centuries of disaster? They survived because resilience was carved into their bones, because hope, however faint, lived inside every mother's lullaby, every father's calloused hand, every child's small smile when a crust of bread was shared. We look back now and see only statistics: death tolls of plague, records of famine, decrees from lords. But hidden in those numbers are millions of untold stories, moments of impossible endurance. A woman spooning her last broth into her child's mouth and going hungry herself. A man burying half his family and still rising to sow seeds for the next season. Children laughing barefoot in the mud, their joy a rebellion against the world's cruelty. These were not accidents of history. They were acts of survival, repeated so many times that kingdoms endured not because of kings, but because of peasants. And that is the mystery worth uncovering. Not how the powerful lived, but how the powerless endured. Because the truth is simple: without their survival, there would be no kings, no castles, no history to tell at all. The mystery of survival in the Middle Ages is not about great battles or golden crowns. It is about ordinary people, peasants, who woke each day into a world that seemed designed to break them, and yet somehow they endured. If you want to understand their resilience, you must step inside their silence, listen to the fears they never dared to voice, and see the hidden choices they made when no one else was watching. Picture a mother, sitting by a dying fire in the depth of winter. Her children sleep beside her, their breaths shallow from hunger. In her hands, she holds a crust of bread, so small it would barely fill her own mouth. She looks at it, feels the ache in her stomach twist like a knife, and then quietly places the bread between her children, watching them chew slowly in their dreams. She closes her eyes and swallows nothing. This is not a story of heroes or saints. This is survival. Now imagine a father returning from the Lord's fields after a day of endless plowing. His back is bent, his hands blistered, his body nearly broken. But as he enters the hut, he forces a smile for his children, lifts them in his arms, and tells them stories of brighter days he does not truly believe will come. He lies, not out of cruelty, but out of love, because sometimes hope is the only shield a parent can give. This, too, is survival. Survival during plague meant more than escaping sickness. It meant learning to live among the dead. Whole families gone, huts abandoned, fields overgrown, the air filled with the stench of bodies buried in shallow graves. Yet the peasants who remained found ways to keep moving. They shared herbs, whispered about in secrecy, hung charms above their doors, and prayed until their throats ached. Some burned fires to ward off the air they believed was poisoned. Others fled into forests, hiding like hunted animals. They did not understand the sickness, but they understood one thing: to stop fighting was to die. And so they clung to life with desperation. When famine struck, it was not only the body that starved, but the spirit. Peasants watched their fields shrivel, their animals die, their children grow weak. They chewed bark, boiled weeds, crushed acorns, and stretched flour with dust. Their world was reduced to survival in its purest form, keeping a single spark of life alive in the face of emptiness. Families bartered with whatever they had: tools, clothing, even themselves, to buy one more meal, one more day. And when even that failed, they relied on each other. Villages shared scraps. Neighbors left small offerings of food at doors under cover of darkness. These quiet acts of mercy kept hope alive when the world seemed intent on extinguishing it. And always, the lords loomed over them. Taxes demanded in grain and labor, even when the harvest failed. Punishments swift and merciless if those demands were not met. To survive meant obedience, silence, and humility. Even when anger burned like fire in their chests, it meant kneeling when every part of them wanted to stand. But hidden beneath that obedience was a quiet defiance, the refusal to vanish, the refusal to give up. They endured because they had no choice, and that endurance itself was rebellion. The greatest mystery is not that peasants survived one plague, one famine, one cruel lord. The mystery is that they survived centuries of them, generations born into hunger and hardship, raised in fear, buried in shallow graves. And still, their children grew, their villages endured, and their blood carried forward. Kingdoms rose and fell, castles crumbled, dynasties ended, but peasants remained. Without them, the very foundations of Europe would have collapsed. Their survival cannot be explained by luck alone. It was built on resilience, on love, on small acts of sacrifice, repeated endlessly in the shadows of history. A mother giving her meal to her child, a father working until his body broke, just to see another harvest, a neighbor sharing medicine in secret, a village dancing during a feast day, laughing in defiance of despair. These moments, invisible to kings and scribes, are the reason humanity endured the Middle Ages. And so, the mystery remains. Why does history not tell their story? Perhaps because their survival was not glorious enough for chronicles? Perhaps because their strength was too ordinary to be sung about in ballads? Or perhaps because those in power wanted their silence, not their voice. But the truth is clear. Without them, there would be no castles, no courts, no history at all. This is the hidden story you were never taught, the story of peasants who survived plagues, famine, and lords. The story of resilience, stronger than disease, hunger, and cruelty. The story of people who refused to disappear. And that is the greatest mystery of all. Not how they lived, but how they endured. The first light of dawn touches the horizon, but in a medieval village, the day begins long before the sun has fully risen. For the peasants, sleep is never a luxury, only a pause between burdens. The night has been cold. Thin walls of mud and straw did little to keep out the chill, and the smoke from the hearth, kept alive through the hours of darkness, lingers in the air, stinging eyes and throats. A rooster crows, its sharp cry tearing through the silence, and the village stirs. From huts no larger than a single room, peasants rise. From straw mats and wool blankets patched 100 times, a woman moves first. Her back is stiff, her hair tangled, her feet bare on the dirt floor. She bends to stir the embers of last night's fire, coaxing flame from the dying glow. The smoke curls upward, dark and bitter, filling the cramped room. She coughs but continues, because the fire means bread, warmth, and life. Children whimper, still wrapped in sleep, their bellies empty. From the night before, the woman whispers to them, promising food she is not sure she can give. She pulls on a coarse wool dress, one she has worn through countless seasons, patched at the elbows and torn at the hem. In her hands, the fabric feels rough, but there is no choice. There is only what survives. Her husband, already awake, ties a rope around his waist. He steps outside, greeted by the cold mist that rolls over the fields. His breath steams in the air, and his boots sink into the damp soil. The village lies quiet, but alive. Goats bleating in the distance, a dog barking, the creak of wooden doors opening one by one. The dawn is not gentle here. It does not bring peace, but work. Work that begins before the sun and continues until long after it has set. The man walks toward the fields, where wooden plows wait. He runs a hand over the soil, wet and heavy, and sighs. The harvest depends on this land, on weather he cannot control, on luck he cannot touch. He knows the Lord will take a share, regardless of what the earth gives, and yet he bends, ready to labor again, because to stop is to die. Back in the hut, the woman kneads dough with aching hands. The bread is thin, made from barley, mixed with ground peas and weeds to stretch what little flour remains. She bakes it on stone, the smell filling the hut. For a moment, her children smile. For a moment, the day feels lighter, but she knows this bread must last until tomorrow. Outside, the village grows louder. Buckets clatter at the well as women draw water, gossiping in hushed tones about the sickness in the next town or the soldiers spotted on the road. The sound of axes echoes as men cut wood for the day's fire. A cart creaks as it is pulled along the muddy path, its wheels leaving deep ruts in the soil. The church bell tolls faintly from the hill. Its sound is not just a call to prayer, but a reminder. God watches, and so does the Lord. Religion and duty bind these peasants as tightly as hunger and survival. They cross themselves, whisper prayers, and move on with their labor, because faith may be the only shield they have. As the sun rises, the village comes alive in rhythm. Men in the fields bend over plows, their bodies silhouetted against the pale sky. Women tend to gardens, fetch water, spin wool into yarn. Children herd geese or pick stones from the soil, their laughter rare but precious. Each task, no matter how small, is tied to survival. Each act is a thread woven into the fragile fabric of life. But dawn in the village is not only about labor, it is about fear. Fear of what the day might bring. A messenger could arrive with news of taxes increased, or of war, or of plague spreading closer. A soldier could pass through and take what little food remains. A sudden storm could drown the fields. Every day begins with a question: what will this day steal from us? And yet, there is something else, something just as powerful as fear. Hope, thin, fragile, but alive. Hope that the fields will yield enough grain to fill bellies through the winter. Hope that the children will survive another season. Hope that tomorrow might be kinder than today. The peasants rise with dawn, not because they want to, but because they must. And still, within that must, there is strength. A mother humming softly as she weaves, a father teaching his son how to sharpen a scythe, children chasing each other along the muddy road when chores are done. These moments, small and fleeting, are what give them the courage to face another dawn. By midday, the village hums like a living machine. Smoke rises from every chimney. Fields ripple with bent backs. The air filled with the bleating of sheep and the clang of tools. But it all begins here, at dawn, when the peasants, weary but unbroken, step once more into the endless cycle of survival. Because dawn is not just the beginning of a day. In a medieval village, dawn is proof that life continues, that despite famine, plague, and lords, the peasants endure. They rise, they work, they love, they hope, and that endurance, repeated every morning, is the greatest story never told. The sun may rise for the peasants, but it never rises without the shadow of the Lord. Every step they take, every grain they harvest, every breath they draw, is owed to the figure who lives not in mud and straw, but in stone and iron, the Lord. His castle stands on the hill, like a predator, watching from above, its walls looming against the sky, reminding the village below of who truly owns their lives. In the morning light, while peasants bend over their fields, the castle gates creak open. Armed men ride out on horses, their armor glinting in the sun. The sound of hooves striking the earth echoes like thunder, sending chickens scattering and children running for cover. These men do not come as neighbors. They come as reminders. The land may feed the peasants, but it belongs to the Lord, and so do they. The Lord himself rarely sets foot in the village. His presence is a rumor, a whisper, a figure glimpsed only at feasts or judgments. But his power is felt in every demand, every tax, every punishment. His men carry his word, and his word is law. A sack of grain taken from a family means nothing to him, but it is the difference between life and death for those who tilled the soil to grow it. Inside the huts, the peasants know the sound of armored boots on their threshold. They know the knock that is not a request, but a command. Payment must be made. Grain, eggs, wool, coin if any remains. A woman clutching her infant trembles as soldiers take the last hen from her yard. A father grits his teeth as he hands over the seed meant for next season's planting. They want to shout, to resist, but they know the cost. The stocks, the whip, or worse, the dungeon. The Lord's shadow does not only fall in taxes, it falls in fear. The peasants whisper about what happens to those who defy him. A man who refused to pay his dues was dragged to the castle and never returned. A woman accused of stealing from the Lord's stores was made to kneel in the square, mocked and beaten until she collapsed. These stories spread like smoke, poisoning the air with dread. Yet still, the peasants endure. They bow their heads, they mutter obedience, but in their hearts, resentment burns. They know the Lord dines on meat and wine, while they chew crusts of bread. They know his halls are warm, while their huts shiver in the cold. They know he hunts for sport, while they starve for survival, and still, they live beneath his shadow. Because to step outside, it is to invite ruin. At the castle, the day unfolds differently. While peasants labor from dawn to dusk, the Lord wakes to the sound of servants bustling through grand chambers. His breakfast is laid with bread, cheese, meat, and wine. He does not think of where it comes from, or of the hands that bled to provide it. To him, the peasants are numbers, dues, labor, nothing more. And yet, in a twisted way, his life is bound to theirs. Without their sweat, his fields would lie barren. Without their toil, his coffers would run dry. Without their silence, his power would crumble. He needs them, but he will never admit it. Instead, he cloaks that truth in dominance, in fear, in rituals of obedience designed to remind them that they are less. The church aids him in this control. Priests preach obedience as holy, reminding peasants that to serve their Lord is to serve God. They are told that their suffering on earth will earn them reward in heaven. The Lord sits in the front pew, nodding solemnly, his authority sanctified by Scripture. And so, the peasants lower their eyes, their chains wrapped in the language of faith. But sometimes, shadows create rebellion. In hushed voices, at night, by the dying fire, peasants speak of lords who fell. They tell of uprisings in far-off villages, of men who dared to fight back. These whispers are dangerous, but they are also intoxicating. A young man, weary of hunger, clenches his fists and dreams of storming the castle. A mother, holding her starving child, wonders if obedience is truly the will of God or merely the will of men. These questions are seeds, and though most die in silence, some take root. Still, the shadow is heavy. It hangs over marriages, births, and deaths. A wedding is not only a union of two hearts, but a calculation of dues. A birth is not just joy, but another mouth to feed, another tax to pay. Even in death, the Lord's shadow follows. The family must pay to bury their dead in consecrated ground. Life and death alike are debts. The peasants endure, but they are not blind. They see the irony, the cruelty, the imbalance. A boy who dreams of being a knight knows he will never hold a sword. A girl who wishes to be free knows she will never leave the fields. Their futures are written before they can speak, dictated by the shadow of the Lord. And yet, Within that shadow, they find ways to live. A stolen moment of laughter around the hearth, a shared loaf of bread among neighbors, a song sung quietly while working in the fields. These are acts of defiance, small but powerful. They prove that even in the darkest shadow, the human spirit finds light. The Lord may cast his shadow across the land, but he cannot fully extinguish what lies beneath it. The peasants bend, but they do not break, and perhaps in their endurance there is a kind of victory, a quiet rebellion that no whip, no tax, no dungeon can ever destroy. The land is not soft, it is stubborn, resisting every attempt to be tamed. The plow creaks under the strain, oxen snort and pull, and the man behind them drives the blade into the heavy earth. Sweat drips from his brow, even in the chill of morning, soaking into the rough linen shirt that clings to his body. His hands are raw, blistered from years of gripping wood and iron. He does not complain. Complaints do not ease hunger, nor do they lighten the soil. Beside him, his son, no older than 10, stoops to gather stones from the furrows, his small body trembling with the effort. He dreams of running in the meadow, of chasing geese by the pond, but there is no time for dreams. Every pair of hands must contribute. Childhood is a luxury peasants cannot afford. In another corner of the village, women gather to spin wool. Their fingers move quickly, twisting fibers into thread. Their motions steady and precise, despite the ache in their wrists. The spinning wheel hums like a quiet song, the only music allowed during their endless tasks. Nearby, pots of porridge bubble over fires, the smell thin and bitter, but enough to keep bellies alive for another day. The endless toil does not rest with the seasons. Each month brings new demands. Spring means plowing and planting, long days bent over fields. Summer brings weeding, tending animals, and haymaking. Autumn is harvest, the most grueling of all, when the village labors from dawn to dusk, knowing the Lord's men will arrive to take their share before their own children are fed. Winter is no reprieve. It is mending clothes, cutting wood, fetching water through ice, patching roofs against storms. To be a peasant is to work, not sometimes, not often, but always. Yet toil is not only physical, it is mental, spiritual. Each task is a reminder of the fragile line between survival and death. If the crop fails, if the animals sicken, if illness strikes, their labor means nothing. The peasants work with desperation, each seed planted carrying the weight of their lives. The women bear a double burden. They labor in the fields beside men, swinging sickles, bending to gather grain, their backs as bent and their hands as bloodied. Then, when the fields are done, they return to their huts, where the work begins again, cooking, mending, nursing, cleaning. A woman may give birth in the morning and be seen in the fields by afternoon, her newborn swaddled and strapped to her back as she bends to reap. There is no pause, no mercy. Even children, too small to carry tools, are given tasks. They watch geese, herd goats, carry water in buckets larger than their arms. They laugh, as children do, but their laughter is brief, swallowed quickly by exhaustion. Their toys are sticks and stones, their games woven into labor. A child may learn to weave a basket, not as play, but because the family needs it to store grain. Toil is endless because it is enforced. The peasants may wish to rest, but the land and the Lord do not allow it. If the fields are not worked, hunger comes. If the taxes are not paid, punishment follows. There is no room for laziness. no place for idleness. Even sickness is not excuse enough. A man with fever still drags himself to the fields. A woman with aching limbs still spins her wool. To stop is to die. The peasants measure their lives, not in years, but in cycles of work. A man recalls not the joy of his youth, but the harvest. When the rains came early, a woman remembers not her wedding day, but the season when her hands bled from threshing grain. Their lives are stories of toil, passed down in scars and calluses rather than words, and yet, within this endless labor, there are flickers of humanity. A man teaching his son how to guide the oxen, his voice soft, despite the harshness of the task. A woman humming a lullaby as she spins, her baby cradled beside her, children chasing each other between chores, their laughter rising above the fields for a moment, like sunlight piercing clouds. These are small mercies, but they are enough to remind the peasants that they are still alive. By dusk, bodies are bent and broken, hands blistered, backs aching, eyes heavy with exhaustion. The fields are silent again, save for the rustle of wind through the crops. Families return to their huts, carrying baskets of weeds or bundles of wood, their feet dragging through the mud. Inside, they collapse on straw mats, eating what little remains of their bread, their hands too tired to lift spoons. The fire glows dimly, shadows dancing across the walls. But even as they sleep, their toil is not over. Dreams are filled with fields, with plows, with the crack of whips, with the cries of hungry children. Dawn will come again, and with it, the circle will continue. This is the endless toil of peasants. It has no beginning, no end, only repetition, and yet, through it all, they endure, not because they choose to, but because they must. And in that endurance lies a story not of glory, but of survival. The village may run on sweat and soil, but it is women who hold its fragile world together. From the moment a girl can walk, her life becomes a chain of tasks, quiet, unseen, and relentless. Her burden is silent, but it is everywhere, woven into the rhythm of every day, crushing yet invisible. At dawn, while men ready their plows, women are already awake. The fire must be lit, though smoke stings their eyes. Bread must be baked, though the dough sticks to tired hands. Children must be fed, even if the bowl is nearly empty. Before the rooster finishes its crow, a woman has already lived half a day in service to others. Her duties stretch endlessly, flowing from hut to field, from child to husband, from Lord's demand to church's command. She reaps beside the men, bent under the same sun, her hands raw from the sickle's edge. Yet when the field work ends, her day does not. The men return to rest, but she returns to chores, grinding grain, fetching water, mending torn clothes, washing in cold streams until her knuckles crack. The silent burden is more than labor, it is sacrifice. A woman eats last, after her husband and children, ensuring they have enough. If food runs out, she goes hungry. If clothes wear thin, she shivers, so others can stay warm. Her body becomes the currency of survival, traded in silence, paid in exhaustion. Motherhood is no reprieve. It is another layer of burden. Women bear children in painful succession, their bodies breaking under the weight of endless pregnancies. Many die in childbirth, their screams swallowed by mud walls and prayers whispered too late. Those who survive return to work within days, infants strapped to their backs, while they bend once more over fields. A woman's womb is not her own. It belongs to her family, her lord, her village's survival. And yet, no one speaks of her suffering. The songs sung in the tavern tell of men's harvests, men's battles, men's bravery. The chronicles kept in monasteries record kings, lords, wars, and plagues. Women remain ghosts in history, their toil unrecorded, their burden invisible. They are the silent foundation on which all else is built. Yet their names vanish like smoke. But silence does not mean weakness. In their hidden world, women weave networks of endurance. At the riverbank, while washing clothes, they share whispered secrets and sorrows. At night, around fires, they teach daughters how to survive, how to mend, how to endure. They carry knowledge passed from mother to daughter, herbal remedies, childbirth rituals, recipes to stretch a scrap of food into a meal. This wisdom is unrecognized by lords and priests, but it keeps villages alive. Sometimes, women's burdens take darker turns. When famine strikes, it is women who decide which child eats and which goes hungry. When plague comes, it is women who nurse the sick, wiping sweat from brows, even as they risk death themselves. When lords demand taxes, it is women who give up dowries, sell their last hens, or beg neighbors for scraps. Every crisis lands first on their shoulders, and always they endure. Their silence is not consent, it is survival. To protest is dangerous, to rebel unthinkable. A woman who speaks too loudly may be branded troublesome, shamed, or worse. Yet, beneath lowered eyes, they carry unspoken rage, a quiet storm of resentment that history never records. In rare moments, women carve out small spaces of freedom. A lullaby, sung to a child, soft and trembling, is also a song of defiance. A story told by firelight keeps memory alive when everything else is taken. A stolen laugh with neighbors at the well pushes back against despair. These fragments of joy are fragile, but they are proof that women's spirits cannot be fully broken. Marriage, too, is often another burden. Most women have little choice. Married off young, often in their early teens. Their futures sealed by families, seeking alliances or survival. Love is a dream, rarely afforded. Instead, they enter homes as workers, childbearers, and caretakers. If they are lucky, they find kindness. If not, they endure cruelty in silence. Religion deepens their chains. Priests preach that women must be obedient, pure, silent, and suffering. They are told Eve's sin weighs upon them, that pain in childbirth is divine punishment. The church tells them submission is holy, endurance sacred, and so women bow their heads and bear their burdens with the weight of eternity. But in the quiet, in their own minds, women know the truth. They know their labor sustains life, that their silence hides immense strength. They may not ride to war, but they fight daily battles against hunger, sickness, and despair. Their victories are not sung in ballads, but written in survival itself. A peasant woman's hands tell her story better than words. They are rough, cracked, scarred, proof of years of toil. Her back is bent, her skin weathered, her body aged before its time. Yet her eyes hold a light that even lords cannot extinguish. A light of endurance, of stubborn will, of survival against odds that would crush others. The silent burden of women is endless, but it is also unbreakable. They bend but do not shatter. They cry in silence, but they rise every dawn. They sacrifice without thanks, but they keep families alive, villages standing, and generations moving forward. Without them, the fields would be empty, the hearths cold, the children dead. Without them, the lords' castles would crumble, their taxes unpaid, their armies unfed. The world survives because women carry it upon their shoulders, silently, relentlessly, and with a strength that history refuses to honor. And so, when we speak of medieval peasants, we must not forget the women, the mothers, daughters, wives, and widows, whose lives were nothing but sacrifice. Their burden was silent, but it was the foundation of everything. In the village, children are not children for long. The moment they can stand, they are given tasks. The moment they can carry, they are loaded with burdens. Childhood, as we imagine it today, does not exist. Instead, the children of the fields grow up under the shadow of toil, their laughter smothered by the weight of survival. At first light, while men harness oxen and women stoke fires, children are already at work. The smallest are sent to scare crows from the fields, waving sticks and shouting until their throats ache. Slightly older children herd geese, sheep, or pigs, watching the animals with a sharp eye. For losing one could mean punishment at home. Their bare feet tread through mud and dung, their clothes ragged, their skin chapped from wind and sun. A boy of 6 may be seen trailing behind his father, carrying a bundle of sticks larger than his thin frame. A girl of 7 crouches near her mother, learning to spin thread or patch cloth with trembling hands. These small tasks are not games. They are lessons in survival, training for a lifetime of labor. A child who cannot work is a burden, and in a world where every mouth strains the family's survival, burdens are dangerous. Play exists, but only in stolen fragments. A group of children might chase each other between chores, their laughter quick and fleeting before they are called back to work. They may carve toys from wood or fashion dolls from straw, but these small joys are fragile, quickly broken when a lord's steward rides through demanding taxes, or when winter strips the land bare. Education, for most, is a dream beyond reach. A handful may learn prayers or letters if a kindly priest takes interest, but the vast majority know nothing of books or writing. Their lessons are the soil, the flock, the spindle, the hearth. They learn how to sow, reap, mend, cook, and serve, because survival, not knowledge, is their inheritance. Sons are expected to become their father's shadows, learning to till, plow, and harvest. Daughters are molded into their mother's reflections, carrying water, grinding grain, nursing infants, and weaving cloth. Childhood is not a preparation for life. It is life itself, begun early and ended too soon. And yet, these children carry a resilience that astonishes. They laugh even with empty bellies. They sing as they herd animals. They whisper secrets in the hayloft, or sit wide-eyed by the fire as their elders tell stories of saints, monsters, or faraway wars. In those moments they seem like children anywhere, dreaming, hoping, believing. But dawn always comes, and with it, work. Illness stalks them mercilessly. With no doctors and few remedies, fevers often take the youngest before they can even speak. Malnutrition weakens their bodies, leaving them vulnerable to plagues that sweep through villages. A mother might bury 2 or 3 children before her own hair turns gray, her grief swallowed by the demands of caring for those who remain. And still, children are expected to endure. A boy coughing from sickness may still be sent to the fields to watch sheep. A girl limping from a cut foot must still carry water from the stream. Tears are wiped away quickly, There is no time for softness. Survival allows no luxury of tenderness. Discipline is harsh too. A child who shirks work may feel the sting of a switch or the sharp rebuke of a weary parent. Love exists, but it is tough, practical, stripped of indulgence. Parents know too well that leniency could mean weakness, and weakness could mean death. Yet, even in this world of endless burden, children bring light. Their laughter, however brief, lifts spirits in the darkest days. Their small hands, though clumsy, often bring moments of joy. Flowers picked for a mother, a joke whispered to a tired father, a song hummed at the hearth. These fragile sparks of innocence remind peasants why they endure, why they keep fighting through hunger, plague, and oppression. In the evenings, when work slows and shadows lengthen, families gather around the hearth. Children press close to parents, listening to stories of saints who slayed dragons, of knights who fought in wars, of lands where hunger does not exist. Their eyes grow wide, and for a moment they imagine lives beyond their village, beyond their toil. Dreams flicker in their hearts, dreams of freedom, of escape, of something more. But morning always comes. The rooster crows, and the children of the fields rise again to their endless tasks. Their lives are bound to the soil, their childhoods spent in work, their innocence traded for survival. They grow too fast, laugh too little, and endure too much. Still, their strength is remarkable, for in their small shoulders rests the future of the village. Every boy bent over the fields, every girl carrying water, ensures that life continues. They may be forgotten in history books, their names never written, their faces never painted, but without them, the world would not turn. The children of the fields are proof of resilience, of hope in the harshest conditions. They live brief, burdened lives. Yet in their laughter and tears lies the unspoken truth. Even in endless toil, humanity persists. In a medieval village, nothing loomed larger than the church. Its stone walls rose above thatched roofs. Its bell echoed across fields, and its shadow stretched into every life, binding peasants with both comfort and fear. For the poor, who had so little control over harvests, disease, or lords, the church offered answers, or at least the illusion of them. The day often began and ended with the toll of the church bell. That sound was not just a call to prayer. It was a reminder that God's eyes were always upon them, watching their labor, their suffering, their sins. Children were taught from their first words to cross themselves, to whisper prayers, to kneel before holy images painted in fading colors. For them, faith was not a choice. It was survival of the soul. The peasants clung to the church with trembling hands because it promised something their world could not: hope beyond the grave. In a life where hunger and plague could strike at any moment, the idea of heaven was more than comfort. It was escape. They believed that if they obeyed, if they suffered silently, if they tithed faithfully, then one day, beyond the pain of this earth, joy would finally be theirs. But this promise came at a price. The church demanded obedience, submission, and above all, payment. Every family, no matter how poor, owed a tenth of their meager harvest to the priest. A peasant mother might watch her children starve while handing grain to the church, whispering through tears that God would repay them in eternity. It was faith mixed with fear, devotion tangled with despair. Priests preached that famine, plague, and hardship were punishments for sin, If crops failed, it was not the weather, but God's wrath. If disease spread, it was not dirt and rats, but the judgment of heaven. And so peasants bent their heads lower, begging forgiveness for sins they did not understand, fearing a God who seemed to demand their suffering. Yet, in the same breath, the church gave comfort. A candle lit in the chapel could ease a grieving mother's heart. The sound of hymns echoing through cold stone walls could make peasants feel part of something greater, something holy. The church bound them together in shared rituals, baptisms, weddings, funerals, moments when the weight of survival was briefly lifted by the promise of divine meaning. The priests themselves were figures of both reverence and suspicion. Some were kind, offering counsel, blessing the sick, sharing knowledge of herbs and healing. Others were corrupt, feeding off fear, living richer than the very Lord's peasants served. In every village, the priest's word was law, shaping not only souls, but lives. For women, the church was a double burden. Preachers declared them the daughters of Eve, cursed with sin, told their suffering in childbirth was divine punishment. They were warned to obey their husbands as they obeyed God, to remain silent, pure, and humble. A woman who strayed from this path risked whispers of witchcraft, exile, or worse. For children, the church was both school and cage. They learned prayers long before letters, and tales of saints long before any worldly story. The fear of hellfire was hammered into their minds, shaping obedience through terror. Yet, the glow of candlelight, the solemn beauty of chants, gave even the youngest a sense of belonging, of order in a world that seemed cruel and chaotic. The church's shadow stretched even into death. When plague swept through villages, it was priests who carried the last rites, crossing themselves quickly as they moved from bed to bed, whispering prayers to frightened families. Cemeteries filled, bells tolled endlessly, and peasants believed their loved ones' souls rose to heaven or burned in hell, based on the priest's words. But in the quiet of their huts, peasants sometimes whispered doubts. If God was merciful, why did children die? If heaven was just, why did lords feast while they starved? These thoughts were dangerous, heretical, but they haunted many hearts. And still, when the bell rang, they knelt again, trapped between fear and faith, unable to break free from the church's grasp. In truth, the church was as much master as the Lord. It controlled not only land, but belief, not only wealth, but hope. It was both cage and comfort, both shadow and light. For peasants, there was no escaping it. The church shaped every birth, every harvest, every death, every prayer. It was the one constant in a world of uncertainty, and its shadow stretched longer than any sunrise. And so, peasants lived their lives bowed under two powers: the Lord, who owned their bodies, and the church, who claimed their souls. The fields demanded sweat, the church demanded faith, and both demanded obedience. In this way, dawn to dusk, cradle to grave, the peasants endured, forever beneath the church's shadow. For a medieval peasant, the soil was both life and death. The earth gave them food, but it was never fully theirs. Every furrow they plowed, every seed they planted, every grain they harvested, carried with it an invisible chain. That chain was taxes, an endless demand from those above, crushing the backs of those below. A family might rise at dawn, sweat through the day, and finally gather enough to feed themselves. But when the steward came riding down the lane, tallying sacks of grain, counting livestock, measuring fields, it became clear. Survival was not their reward. It was rent for the privilege of staying alive. The Lord demanded his share first. Fields may have been plowed by peasant hands, but the land belonged to the manor. A man might toil from spring to harvest, yet at the end, much of what he grew was swept away in carts headed to the castle. Wheat, oats, barley, eggs, chickens, everything had value, and everything had to be handed over. Then came the king's taxes. Wars fought far away, castles built on distant hills, knights armored in steel. Peasants paid for it all. They did not ride in battles, but their coin fed soldiers, their grain-filled wagons. Their sweat bankrolled the ambitions of men who had never stepped in mud, and still, the church stretched out its hand. A tenth of every harvest, no matter how meager, was owed to God. The poorest mother, who struggled to feed her children, was forced to surrender the first and best of her grain. A father might weep as he handed over his last chicken, whispering to his hungry family that God would repay them in heaven. All of this meant that peasants lived on the edge of starvation. After the Lord, king, and church had taken their share, what remained was often not enough. A family might huddle in their hut, dividing a crust of bread into 5 parts, knowing that their labor had filled the bellies of others, while their own remained empty. The burden was relentless. Taxes did not ease in famine years. They grew harsher. When crops failed, peasants were still expected to pay. If they could not, they were forced into debt, borrowing grain from the manor that they could never repay. A poor harvest meant not only hunger, but bondage, chains forged from obligation rather than iron. The fear of collectors haunted villages. Stewards rode through with ledgers, counting every animal, every sheaf of hay. If payments were late, punishment followed. Livestock seized, huts burned, families evicted. A man might labor his entire life, yet a single missed payment could strip everything away. Even holidays brought no relief. Festivals, weddings, even funerals came with fees owed to the church or Lord. Nothing in a peasant's life was free, not even death. Graves in consecrated ground required payment, and many a family gave their last coin to ensure a loved one's soul would not wander unblessed. The bitterness of taxes filled every peasant heart. They watched lords feast while their children starved, priests in fine robes while they wore rags. They endured because they had no choice. To rebel was suicide. To refuse meant ruin. So they bowed their heads, tightened their belts, and handed over their hard-won harvest year after year. Yet beneath the silence, anger simmered. In hushed whispers at night, peasants cursed the weight of taxes. They dreamed of freedom, of keeping what their hands had earned, of a world where sweat brought reward instead of loss. These dreams rarely left their lips, but they burned quietly, fueling stories of outlaws who robbed lords, of distant lands where peasants lived free. The weight of taxes was not just a burden of grain and coin, it was a burden of spirit. It crushed hope, stifled joy, and taught generations that their labor was not their own. Every loaf of bread carried the taste of surrender. Every sip of ale was bitter with sacrifice. And yet, somehow, they endured. Despite the endless demands, peasants found ways to survive, stretching meals, bartering with neighbors, hiding a portion of grain from collectors, praying for mercy. Their resilience was astonishing, though it came at a cost measured in broken bodies and weary souls. The weight of taxes was not measured in coin alone. It was measured in hunger, gnawing at children's bellies, in mothers skipping meals, in fathers bent double by labor. It was measured in dreams deferred, in lives shortened, in freedom stolen. To be a medieval peasant was to live always beneath a shadow, not only of lords and kings, but of the never-ending weight of taxes. They worked, but they did not own. They toiled, but they did not reap. They survived, but only barely, forever feeding the mouths of others. And so the fields, year after year, echoed not just with the sound of sickles and plows, but with the quiet despair of those who knew that, no matter how hard they worked, their lives would never be their own. There are few hungers, like the hunger of famine. For medieval peasants, it was not a rare misfortune, but a shadow that returned again and again. Crops depended on the sky. Too much rain rotted the grain. Too little shriveled it. Winters stretched longer. Storms came harder. Pests devoured fields. And when the harvest failed, it was not only food that disappeared, but hope itself. The first signs were subtle. Bread loaves growing smaller. Bowls of pottage stretched thinner. Mothers secretly skipping meals so their children could eat. Villagers told themselves it would pass, that next week would bring relief. But when the fields stayed bare, the dread became undeniable. Hunger settled in like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. Soon, the poorest families had nothing. They boiled weeds into thin broth, gnawed on bark, or chewed leather softened in water. Children cried at night, their bellies hollow drums of pain. Fathers walked the fields searching for roots or berries, knowing full well there was little to find. The world became an enemy, withholding the very food that sustained life. Grain prices soared. Merchants, sensing profit, hoarded supplies, selling handfuls at impossible prices. Peasants sold tools, livestock, even clothes, just to buy enough to survive another day. And when even those were gone, they turned to begging or stealing. Famine brought not only hunger, but shame. A proud father who once fed his family was reduced to kneeling at a lord's gate, begging for scraps. Mothers wept as they watched their children weaken, unable to provide even a crust of bread. Neighbors who once shared what little they had now turned suspicious, guarding every crumb, fearing that generosity would doom them too. The human body cannot fight famine for long. First comes weakness, then sickness. Children's bellies swelled grotesquely from malnutrition. Their limbs stick thin. Old men and women wasted away in corners, too frail to rise. Entire families vanished quietly, their huts left empty, their hearths cold. The smell of famine was unforgettable. It was the stench of rot, of unwashed bodies, of shallow graves dug hurriedly in frozen ground. The churchyard filled with small mounds, and the toll of funeral bells became a daily dirge. Priests prayed over bodies, but even they could not hide the despair in their voices. And famine tested morality. When hunger bites deep enough, the lines of right and wrong blur. Stories spread of peasants stealing from their neighbors, of fathers abandoning children they could no longer feed, of mothers forced into desperate bargains for a loaf of bread. Darker tales whispered of cannibalism. Families so starved that they turned on the dead, or worse, the living. No one spoke of it openly, but the silence itself carried terror. Yet even in this darkness, small sparks of humanity flickered. A neighbor secretly slipping a crust of bread to a starving child. A mother sharing her last portion equally among all her children, though her own body wasted away. A priest opening the church storehouse in defiance of his lord, risking punishment to keep his flock alive. But famine left scars that never healed, Survivors carried them in their bodies, stooped backs, weakened limbs, hollow eyes. Children who lived through famine often grew stunted, their growth forever stifled by those hungry years, and in their hearts, fear lingered even when harvests returned. Peasants ate with an edge of desperation, never certain when famine would come again. The taste of famine was not just hunger, it was despair. It was the sound of children crying themselves to sleep. It was the sight of mothers burying infants wrapped in rags. It was the silence of a village where laughter had died. No feast, no full harvest could erase it. The memory of famine clung like smoke, haunting every meal, every field. It was a reminder that in their fragile world, survival was never guaranteed, and that the line between life and death was as thin as a crust of bread. For the peasants, famine was not only a season, it was a teacher. It taught them humility, endurance, and the cruel truth that the earth could betray them at any moment. It stripped them bare, forcing them to confront the raw edge of existence. And though they endured marked, forever tasting hunger even when their bellies were full. And so, famine became a part of their story, woven into their lives like thread into cloth. It was not an exception, but a rhythm, a grim reminder that survival was a fragile victory, never to be taken for granted. For medieval peasants, war was a storm that arrived without warning. They did not march in shining armor. They did not sit in councils of kings. But when lords clashed and banners rose, it was the peasant who paid the price. War came to them like fire to dry grass, sweeping across their fields, their homes, their lives. The first sign was often the sound of hooves on distant roads, armored men riding beneath flags they had never seen. Rumors spread like wildfire, armies marching, castles under siege, enemies crossing borders. Peasants who had never left their village suddenly found themselves trapped in a game of power played by men far above them. When war came, crops were trampled by soldiers, storehouses raided for supplies, and animals seized to feed marching armies. A year's labor could vanish in a single night, burned or stolen. Families who had survived famine now faced another cruelty. Armies stripping their world bare, leaving nothing but ashes behind. But worse than hunger was fear. Soldiers did not see peasants as people. They saw them as resources, tools, or worse, obstacles. Women hid their children in cellars and woods, praying soldiers would pass by without noticing. Fires lit the night sky as villages burned, and screams carried on the wind like omens. War did not only come from outside. Lords demanded service. Peasants forced into levies, handed crude weapons, and pushed into battles they did not understand. A farmer who had held only a plow was now given a spear and told to defend his master's land. Few returned, and those who did carried scars that never faded, both on their bodies and in their souls. Even those not sent to fight were not safe. Heavy war taxes were demanded to pay for knights and castles. Families already starving from bad harvests were told to give more or risk punishment. Villages sank deeper into misery, crushed between enemy armies and their own lord's demands. And yet, through this darkness, peasants endured. They dug hidden pits to store grain, built secret shelters in forests, whispered prayers under their breath. They clung to survival as though it were rebellion, resisting not with swords, but with stubborn will. For peasants, war was not glory. It was not banners flying, nor songs of victory. It was fire in the night, hunger in the belly, fear in the heart. It was the loss of sons, the silence of daughters, the weight of endless grief. When the armies finally moved on, villages stood as hollow shells, blackened fields, collapsed huts, empty churchyards. Survivors crept out of hiding, gathering the little that remained, trying to rebuild from nothing. Life returned, but slowly, scarred by war's shadow. And yet, even as they rebuilt, peasants knew another war would come, another banner would rise, another storm would sweep across their fragile world. Because for peasants, war was not an event. It was a cycle, a shadow that always returned. And in that shadow, they lived, bent but unbroken, silent but enduring, nameless but eternal. Their stories were not told in songs of knights or kings, but in whispers carried across fields, whispers of survival against the crushing weight of war. In a medieval village, survival was never an individual act. It was a shared struggle. No family, no matter how strong, could endure alone. The bonds of community were the only shield against the brutal weight of poverty, famine, and war. Yet those bonds, as vital as they were also fragile, stretched thin by hunger, cracked by fear, and sometimes shattered by desperation. Every morning, when the church bell tolled, peasants gathered not only to pray, but to hold each other up. Women traded food, men shared tools, children ran together through fields, knowing their lives were tied like threads in the same cloth. When one family's roof collapsed, neighbors helped repair it. When a cow fell sick, others offered milk until the herd recovered. Without this web of support, no peasant could have endured. But hardship tested even the strongest ties. In years of plenty, generosity flowed freely. A loaf of bread might be split 5 ways. A jug of ale passed around the fire. Yet when famine tightened its grip, suspicion grew. Families who once shared now locked their doors, hiding what little they had. Neighbors eyed each other's fields, wondering who might still have grain hidden in the earth. Trust, once broken, was hard to mend. The community also carried unspoken rules. Everyone knew the cost of standing apart. Those who refused to help in times of need found themselves isolated, whispered about, sometimes even cursed. Reputation was survival, and to lose it meant being cut adrift in a world where loneliness was a death sentence. Festivals and gatherings were more than celebration. They were glue. On feast days, after months of toil, peasants came together, singing and dancing, if only to remind themselves that they were not alone. In laughter, they found strength. In shared stories, they found belonging. Even in suffering, the knowledge that others suffered beside them gave a kind of comfort. And yet, beneath the warmth of community, danger lingered. Old grudges could erupt into feuds. A stolen chicken, a disputed field boundary, a whispered insult. Small sparks could ignite bitter conflict. With no courts to settle matters fairly, neighbors sometimes turned violent, and blood could stain the very soil they depended upon. The church worked to bind them together, preaching charity, brotherhood, and obedience. Priests reminded villagers that their souls were tied not just to God, but to one another. Still, the church itself sometimes deepened divisions, favoring one family over another, enforcing harsh tithes that sowed resentment. Yet despite its flaws, community remained the peasant's last refuge. In the long nights of winter, when winds howled and wolves prowled the edges of fields, families huddled together, surviving because others survived with them. Even the smallest act, a neighbor's firewood, a borrowed cloak, a shared prayer could mean the difference between life and death. The bonds of community were fragile because they were human, strained by fear, hunger, and envy, but they endured because they had to. A single thread could snap, but woven together, the villagers held. In their togetherness lay their only strength against a world that sought to break them apart. Rebellion never began with swords. It began with whispers. In the dim light of a cottage, peasants huddled close, speaking in low voices, afraid even of the walls listening. They were tired of endless taxes, tired of bowing before lords who feasted while their children starved, tired of carrying burdens that bent their backs and broke their spirits. The whispers often began with a single story of a village that refused to pay its dues, of a lord's men driven off with pitchforks, of peasants who stood tall for once. Stories grew as they spread, each telling a little bolder, a little more daring. Hope took root in soil watered with misery. In the fields, men spoke as they swung their scythes. At wells, women muttered as they filled their buckets. Even children sensed it, carrying the words like sparks hidden in their pockets. These whispers carried not only anger, but possibility, that maybe, just maybe, they did not have to live and die as beasts of burden. But whispers were dangerous. Lords feared them more than swords, because they knew rebellion was a fire that could spread faster than armies could march. Spies lurked in every village, ears pricked for seditious words. One loose tongue could doom an entire household. Punishment was swift. Floggings, hangings, villages burned to ash as warnings. And still, the whispers never died. The weight of injustice pressed harder each year. New taxes were demanded, new duties piled on. A peasant could work from dawn till dusk and still owe more than he had. Hunger gnawed and anger festered. Even priests, once voices of obedience, sometimes let their sermons crack with hints of defiance. That God saw the suffering of the poor, that he would not stay silent forever. Then came the breaking points. Moments when patience turned to fury, a child beaten by a tax collector, a woman dishonored by a knight, a village stripped of its last grain in the dead of winter. These wounds cut deep, and in their pain, peasants found courage. Pitchforks and sickles were lifted, not as tools of work, but as weapons. The first shouts of rebellion rang out not in grand castles, but in muddy fields. Men and women alike rose, their voices shaking yet fierce. They burned manor houses, tore down records of debt, and swore oaths to one another that they would no longer live as slaves in their own land. For once, the lords trembled, seeing the fury of those they had long dismissed as powerless. And yet, rebellions rarely lasted. Armies of trained soldiers crushed them swiftly, leaving blood in the streets and bodies hanging at crossroads. Villages paid the price for daring to dream of freedom. Families were broken, leaders executed, survivors branded forever with suspicion. But something had changed. Even when rebellions failed, the memory of them remained. The whispers carried on, sharper now, braver, refusing to be silenced. Peasants learned that they could resist, that they could frighten those who once seemed untouchable. And though defeat was bitter, hope was harder to kill than flesh. For every rebellion crushed, another whisper rose, and those whispers echoed through the centuries, building toward storms yet to come. For medieval peasants, Faith was not just belief. It was air. It was water. It was survival. The church bell marked their days. The priest's words shaped their nights, and God's presence hung over every harvest, every illness, every death. To live without faith was unthinkable, for it was the only explanation for a life filled with pain and toil. Each morning began with prayer, whispered quickly before heading to the fields. Each Sunday, no matter how tired, peasants walked to the village church. Inside its stone walls, under flickering candlelight, they bowed before crucifixes and saints, begging for mercy, forgiveness, or simply endurance. The church was their comfort, promising heaven's glory in exchange for earthly suffering. Yet faith was heavy. It demanded obedience, humility, and sacrifice. The church collected tithes, even when families starved. 1/10 of every harvest, 1 coin from every pocket, given not by choice, but by duty. And still, peasants paid, for to deny the church was to risk damnation, and no hunger could outweigh the fear of eternal fire. Priests preached that suffering was holy, that God tested his people through famine, plague, and war. A starving child was framed as part of God's plan, a peasant's broken back as the path to salvation. For many, these words were cruel, but they clung to them, because without faith, their misery had no meaning. Faith also bound the community. Weddings, baptisms, funerals. Every milestone was marked by the church. When a peasant died, even the poorest coffin carried him beneath the shadow of the cross. In grief, the church gave comfort. In joy, it gave blessing. Its presence was constant, inescapable, like the sky itself. But faith was not always gentle. Fear walked hand in hand with devotion. Tales of hellfire and demons filled sermons, reminding peasants that every misstep could condemn them. Superstition thrived. Witches blamed for storms, spirits for illness, curses for bad harvests. Faith gave meaning, but it also gave terror. For women, faith could be both a sanctuary and a chain. The Virgin Mary was honored, yet real women were told to remain silent, obedient, and pure. A woman who strayed risked not only shame, but eternal punishment. Still, many women found solace in prayer, clinging to the idea that God saw their suffering, even if no man did. There were moments when faith became rebellion in its own way. Some priests, poor as the people they served, dared to criticize lords who oppressed their flock. They reminded peasants that Christ himself had lived among the poor, that heaven was closer to the hungry than to the rich. These words lit quiet sparks of hope, whispers that perhaps God stood with the peasants, not above them. Yet the weight of faith never lifted. Even as peasants endured famine, plague, and war, they were told their suffering was righteous. It gave them endurance, yes, but also resignation. To question the church was to question God himself, a dangerous thought that could lead to exile, punishment, or worse. Still, faith endured because peasants needed it. In their darkest nights, when children starved and war flames rose on the horizon, faith gave them something no lord, no coin, no harvest could. The promise that beyond this cruel world lay another, brighter one. The weight of faith bent them low, but it also kept them standing. It chained them to obedience, but it also bound them to hope. And in that fragile balance, they lived, both burdened and lifted, broken yet believing, forever walking the narrow road between despair and salvation. When we look back at the medieval peasant's life, it is easy to see only the suffering, Plague, famine, war, endless labor under the shadow of lords. But hidden beneath that suffering was something stronger, something more enduring. Survival. The true legacy of the peasant was not defeat, but endurance, carried silently across centuries. Generation after generation, peasants bent their backs to the soil, turning earth into food, building lives out of nothing. They did not rise to power, they did not write books. Their names were not etched into stone monuments, yet they kept the world alive. Kings may have ruled, but peasants fed them. Castles may have risen, but peasants laid the stones. Wars may have raged, but peasants rebuilt the ashes. Their legacy was survival itself. Every field plowed, every loaf baked, every child carried to adulthood in the harshest conditions was an act of defiance. Lords could tax them, armies could strip them, disease could strike them, but still they endured. Even in famine, they found ways to share. Even in war, they found ways to rebuild. Even in plague, they mourned, buried, and carried on. The peasants' endurance was not born of choice, but of necessity. To live in a world designed to crush them and still leave behind families, villages, and traditions was a quiet form of rebellion. They had no swords, but they had resilience. They had no power, but they had persistence. And persistence, over centuries, is stronger than any crown. Their stories were rarely told. History books spoke of kings and knights, not of mothers who nursed starving children through winters, or fathers who gave their last crust of bread to a neighbor. But those untold acts of sacrifice built the very foundation of the world we live in today. Without them, kingdoms would have fallen into ruin long before. Faith carried them. Community sustained them. Hope, fragile yet unbroken, guided them. They believed that their pain had meaning, that their toil was part of something greater. And, in that belief, they found strength enough to carry on, even when reason might have told them to give up. The legacy of the medieval peasant is not written in shining victories, but in survival through darkness. It is in the fields that still feed us, the villages that still stand, the traditions of resilience that echo in our blood. We are all, in some way, the children of peasants, heirs to their endurance. And perhaps the greatest truth of their story is this: though they lived nameless and forgotten, their survival changed the world. They proved that even in the harshest of worlds, even under the heaviest chains, humanity endures. That is their legacy. That is their triumph. So when you think of medieval life, do not remember only the lords in their castles or the knights on their horses. Remember the peasants, the ones who kept going, who kept breathing, who kept the world alive. Their voices may be whispers, but their survival is eternal. And so, the story of the medieval peasant ends not with glory, but with survival. They endured plagues that emptied villages, famines that hollowed stomachs, and lords who demanded more than flesh and blood could give. Yet through it all, they carried on, planting seeds, raising children, keeping hope alive when the world gave them none. But now I want to ask you, imagine living in their shoes, working from dawn to dusk, giving half of what you earn to a lord, and still fearing hunger, sickness, or war. Do you think you could have survived their world? Or would the weight have been too much? Tell me your answer in the comments below. I read every single one, and if you found yourself gripped by the hidden truths of history, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves mystery and history, and subscribe to Crime Unraveled as we continue uncovering the stories most have forgotten. Because, sometimes, survival itself is the greatest rebellion.